Lovely. Okay, so we're back on the Mercury environment for the training this morning. So what we will be building roughly is a task list application. That's the context within which we'll be building this morning. We're going to build this task list in such a way that it's authenticated with single sign-on. So users can log in, they can view their tasks, they can create a task list, and they can add tasks to that task list. So it's a very simple example, but it should demonstrate some of the concepts I sort of mentioned at the outset. On the back end, we'll look at how to manipulate the tables to sort of achieve that goal. And we'll look at find some way of weaving into that context how we use identities in the platform to say interrogate Google or Microsoft or any of these sort of external service that require sort of delegated permissions, for which you can either use the default actions and integrations inbuilt to the Toca platform, or use something like an API caller. So I'll explain that a little bit. So the first thing that we'll do to actually set up for what we're going to build inside of the platform is to first actually set up our Google tenancy. Now, it's very common that when you're building in the platform, you want to do either of these things. You either want to interact with a backend service as a given user to say, I don't know, you might be, for example, reading an email inbox for emails and pulling attachments to begin your automation, or you might be wanting to pull data down from SharePoint, pull an Excel file down from SharePoint, transform it into a table, and then store that inside of a data store. Those are two good examples. You might also, in the application side, as I said, want to authenticate against that application using single sign-on, either for an external set of users or an internal set of users. And so to do all of this, we need some sort of identity provider that we're going to be working with. The example that I'm going to use today will be Google, because we use Google internally. But it's worth knowing that this is also doable, although it will look slightly different with something like Microsoft Azure and Entra ID. So what we'll do first, and what I'll say here is that one of the nice things that's come with 7.5 in the platform, if you haven't been on Mercury and haven't seen it already, is there is documentation throughout the platform. And this includes documentation on how to set up, say, an identity provider. So you can see you've got some instructions for Microsoft and for Google as specific examples, because these we find are pretty commonly used across our client base and across our sort of partners as well. So we'll be taking Google as the example that we use today. Okay, so let's start by creating the application registration in Google. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new project over here. So we'll call this training session 2, and I'll create that. Okay, and we'll switch across. As soon as it's ready, we'll switch across to training session 2. So you can see exactly the sort of things that you'd need to consider when you're setting up such an application registration. So just to say here, the application registration, what this is being used for is when we interact with Google on behalf of a given user, either to sign into the app or to, say, read a set of emails from an inbox on the back end. We need to set up an application registration so that Google recognizes the calls that are coming from Toca and returns, obviously, the right data back with the correct permissions for Toca to act on behalf of that user. So that's precisely what the application registration is designed to set up. So I've got a new project here. I'm going to go to APIs and services. Again, this will vary by platform provider. And the first thing we're going to do is enable the Gmail API for Google, so that I can read later. I can read emails from the inbox. So I'll enable that here. All being well. There we go. Lovely. So in order to use this, what we need to do now is actually configure our application registration. and in particular our OAuth consent screen. So both for the sign on the front end and for the automation back end, Toca uses the OAuth, the authorization token code token flow. And what that means is the user will log in, we'll make a request out to Google to sign them in, so to the authentication endpoint. So the user will be redirected to sign in with, say, Google in this example. Once they've signed in, that will return an access token back to Toca, and Toca then uses that or returns an authorization code back to Toca. Toca uses that authorization code to go and get an access token and a refresh token, which it can use on subsequent calls to authenticate as on behalf of that user, and then get whatever data is required, whether that's signing in or pulling email data. So that's the OAuth flow. What we'll do here is I'm going to set the user type to internal. Okay, I'm going to give this a name, so I'll call it, opening a new tab, we'll call it training session 2. I'll use my email, I'll bother with a URL. Email address, we'll do Ben Roberts, as well, save and continue. And then here, what we need to do in our scopes is add the set of permissions which we want Toca to be able to use on behalf of our user. So for the front end, for single sign-on, and again, you'll find this listed in the documentation. For the front end, we'll need 3 scopes. So we'll need OpenID, which is Google's way of telling us who is signing into the application. We'll need the email scope, and we'll need the profile scope, giving us access to that user's email and their profile information, including, say, their profile picture and their name, etc. So we will add some scopes here. First scopes we'll add will be that OpenID scope. So we'll add that here. We'll also find the profile scope. Here it is. We'll find the so we've got OpenID profile, find the email scope as well. Okay, email. And now we also need, so that comprises our front end scopes for single sign-on. And then if we want to use this identity also on the back end, then we'll need the scope relating to Gmail so that we can see the user's email and modify it. So here you can see there's a scope here for mail.com to read, compose, and delete email. And I'll just copy this so that I've got access to this later. So I'll update that. You'll see it adds those OpenID scopes up here to non-sensitive scopes and the Gmail on there. And that's basically our app set up. In addition to that, what we need to do is we need to create a set of credentials, again, that Toca can use to interface with this registration using the scopes we've set up. So over here in credentials, I'll create some new credentials, in particular an OAuth client ID. So it's for a web application, which again, we'll just call training session 2. And the most important thing here is that we provide this credential with the correct redirect URI. Now, again, this will vary per provider in terms of how they lay out all of these screens and where they ask for various redirect URIs and client IDs and the rest of it. But essentially, this is a way for Google to know which URL it expects to be directing user back to after they've signed in using that account, for example. So in particular, the 2 that we need here, and we can see again which we need if we open up the documentation, we need HTTPS platform URL /assets/oauth.html if we want to use the identity in the backend in automation. And we need apps.toca platform URL /API/auth/callback if we want to use this for single sign-on for apps in the front end. So what I'll do is we will grab this one and we'll pop it in here, and we'll just replace obviously that placeholder value there with, in this case, it's Mercury, which is our training platform. So just remove the action link there. So that will sort us for the back end.
Sorry to interrupt you, Ben. We don't have this option to access the settings option, documentation, URL, all these. And the Mercury, we don't have this option.
You should do. If you're visiting https mercury.toca.cloud and you visit the admin well, you won't be able to visit the admin console, but
Yeah, we don't have.
say, for example, from the automation, you should see a little eye here like this. But if that's a problem that you're experiencing, Venkat, we can take it offline.
Okay.
So what I'll do here is I'll open up again, I'll just open this back up and we'll grab URL here. Again, I'll just replace this portion with the platform URL and we'll create. And there you go. It's provided me now with a client ID and secret that I can use to now set up this platform inside of Toca. So I'll download this as a JSON file. So this will be useful. I'll open it up behind the scenes. So you won't be able to see this. But what we'll now do is we'll head to Toca and we'll create an identity provider using that information. So I'm going to add a new one here. Again, I'll just call it training session 2. The client ID will be the one which Google's provided me there. So I'll grab that and paste it in. Downloading that JSON has also provided me with a token URI. So I'll paste that in here. An auth endpoint as well, or an auth URI. And the user info endpoint, which I need, I can find actually, again, using that documentation. If I open this in a new tab, we can see for Google, for example, here, this is the user info endpoint. And I'll explain exactly what that user info endpoint is for in just a moment. The client secret, I'll also paste in. So grab this and paste in here. The identity type will set to OpenID. And you can see by doing this, Toca automatically discerns that we need the OpenID profile and email scopes that we added before. And finally, just to match this up with the consent screen and the scopes that we added inside of Google, we'll take this scope, the mail.google.com scope, and also add that here as well. So we'll call this Gmail or Gmail full access, and we'll paste the scope value in there. So now we've got an identity provider here with 4 scopes. And if we wanted to, we could also upload an icon actually. So let's do that just for just so we know which icon we're dealing with. Platform. So let's save that. And I'll upload it here. And now we know that we're using this for, there it is. Now we know that we've got our training session 2 set up with the client ID, token endpoint, auth endpoint, user info endpoint, identity type, and icon as well. So one thing I will do is we'll just see if I've got a good pictographic diagram of how this auth flow will work. Let's have a look. Lovely, here we go. So the way that this works roughly is, so what we've done here is we've set up the identity provider in Toca. And this identity provider that we've created is basically a shell for holding the credentials that we need each time a user works through this flow to authenticate. So within Toca, what will happen is we'll hit the authorization endpoint with a list of the scopes or permissions that we want to sort of perform on behalf of that user. So in this case, it'll be this auth endpoint here, and the scopes we'll provide it will be OpenID, email, and profile for single sign-on, and just the Gmail scope for the backend. We'll also provide the client ID, so Google knows who we are and which application registration we're trying to interact with, and the secrets. This is like your sort of username and password, I guess. That will then send the user in their browser to the identity provider. So they'll be redirected to, say, a Google sign-in page. That once the user's logged in, all being well, it will send the authorization code that it produces back to the redirect URI. The redirect URI being the when we set up our credentials in Google, being either this URI if we're working on the backend, or this URI if we're working in apps. Token then receives that authorization code. It sends it then to the token endpoint. So this token endpoint being the first one here. And then Google, or whatever identity provider it is, will return an access token back to Toca that can then be used to authenticate with that endpoint. And so that's what's stored as an identity in the back end, or simply stored as user credentials for single sign-on in the front end. So that's the rough flow. So just to demonstrate how this is working now, let's actually step across and create our application. So we'll create a new application here, and I'll call it my task list app. Let's call it app, task list, training, app slug. We'll call training task list. We'll give it a favicon. So let's find our Toca brand. There we go. We want to restrict access to our application, but this time, instead of using a standard username and password, we'd like to use OpenID. Now, from here, the identity provider we'll select will be our training session 2 provider that we just set up. You can see Toca automatically, given its OpenID, infers that we need these 3 scopes. This is part of the sort of OpenID standard. The profile API URL is precisely the user info endpoint that we added to our provider earlier. So if we actually just step across back to our identity provider and to our docs, we should just be able to grab the user info endpoint for Google here. And we can pop back, paste that in here. And now we've got these fields to populate. So the flow in apps is very similar to the one that I showed you here for OAuth. The difference here is that in addition to this sort of access token, what we'll also get back from Google when we're using OpenID is we'll take all subsequently, after all of this has happened, it will subsequently hit the identity provider one more time at this user info endpoint to get more information about the user. Again, in accordance with the OpenID standard. So in particular, it's going to use these scopes, the OpenID profile and email, and it's expecting to get back some information about who this is, what their profile looks like, and what their email is. So these 3 fields here, what we're actually received back, what Toca will receive back when it hits this address. In fact, I wonder if I paste it into a browser, I wonder if it'll actually, yeah, you can see it's just returning some JSON here. Yeah, there you go. It's expecting an OS2 access token, which is precisely what it returned before. But you can see it's going to put some JSON back. And so the fields that we're adding here are actually the fields to the various bits of information that we've requested via these scopes inside of that JSON. So it will vary by provider. Obviously, you'll need to look at the documentation to know what's required here. But for Google, it's ID for the ID field. It's email for the email field. And we'll actually also use the email as well for our username. So what we're expecting is a chunk of JSON back, which looks like the following, just to really illustrate this point clearly. So we're expecting Google here to send back a chunk of JSON which looks like this. So something which looks like ID is, whatever random ID it is, email Ben while signing in, ben.robertson.toca.io, and then finally maybe some sort of username field. Roberts, let's say. And you can see all I'm doing here inside of my app configuration is I'm pointing Toca, I'm telling it which field is which. So which one to get the ID from, which one to get the email from, which one to get the username from. In this case, I'm just using the username for the email as well. Additionally, if there's anything else that comes in that JSON, so a good example would be Microsoft, for example. If you set up an Azure app registration, you can infer which Active Directory groups a user is part of. This JSON chunk might also include something like a field called groups, and then it might be a list of groups that they're part of in Azure, something like this. So again, what we can actually do here, if we want to, is add additional mappings. And we can map each of the fields to a subsequent field in Toca. So we can say the groups field is going to map to something in Toca called the groups field. Of course, for Google, not required, so we don't need this. We'll automatically register new users. For now, we don't need any data source etc. We'll add those later, and then we can create our application. So just show you how this is working. Let's delete that page. We'll restrict access to our home page. And you can see that Toca's already gone to the hassle of setting up a couple of groups for our app. Any authenticated user is going to be automatically added to this authenticated user group. And just check that this is working. We'll add a flex layout to our page with a bit of text just to say test. There we go, test. And if we save this and deploy it out, then when we access it, we should see that we can get onto this application now with single sign-on. So we'll just bear with it there while it ticks through. And now if we open this link in an incognito window, just show you what it's actually doing. Or maybe not an incognito window actually, because you won't be able to see that. But if you pay attention to the URL, this one, training task list. So pay attention to the URL in the browser, because what you should see is that I'll hit this URL, I'll be redirected to Google, and then I'll be redirected back into Toca. And obviously, because I'm already signed into Google, this will sort of happen automatically. So it goes to the app. Have I, as a month ago, have I accessed the right application? No, I haven't. What did I call my app? Am I sharing app users with another group, potentially? What have I done here? Done something really weird, I think. Let's have a look at this application instead then. I think I've maybe mislaid my app. Maybe training test. What do we call this one? Training task. So see what happens. Okay, I'll have a little look at this one then. The training test, it kicks me out to Google to authenticate, and then it brings me back into the application here. And now my app users, you can see that it's taken in. Let's just check, is this the right? Yes, okay, lovely. So you can see here, it's taken me back to the Toca application, and it's showing me the homepage, which you can see, as I said, I've restricted access on here. So this is now working with single sign-on on Google. So that's really nice to see. Just to illustrate that a little bit more carefully, let's see if I can take the same link and put it in an incognito window. So if I put this into an incognito window, what you'll actually see is it explicitly kicks me out to Google because I'm not signed in automatically via my browser. So I could now log in using my Google account in this case, and my password. And one of the nice things, obviously, about single sign-on is that if you've got any sort of two-step authentication set up on your device or on your account, then it will take effect on your application as well. So you can then get into the app. So let's try getting a verification code instead. See if Google sends it through. I'm not getting the text message. Oh, I need to confirm the phone number, I see. Just do that. I'll share my screen again. So, there you go. It calls me back into Toca, and then it signs me in, and you can see I'm on my home page, and I can see that test text. So there we go. That's single sign-on correctly configured for our app. So let me go back. We'll share the core platform again. Here we go. And now we can actually crack on with developing our application. So that's the sign on the front end. Let's have a look at how to do something very similar for interacting. We'll use the same identity provider in the back end to say, get a list of my emails. To do this, I'm just going to grab a little query here, which I'll use later, but we'll do this from scratch. So we'll call this automation auto task list, and we'll create. So we've got let's just recap what we've done. So we've set up the identity provider in the back end. When we use that with single sign-on on an application, the user that's signing in is obviously sort of inferred by whichever user logs into that application. So it's taking the details in this identity provider, and then it's using them to go and get the info about the user, bring it back to the app, and provide that info to Toca for the email, etc. Now, when we want to use identity providers in automation, we need to store specific user credentials in a data store so that that user's credentials can be used over and over and over again to interact with the provider. So in this case, what I'd like to do is say, have Toca talking to my inbox. It might be an inbox that you set up especially for whatever process you're running. But in this case, it'd be my inbox, and I want to grab a certain set of emails out of that inbox and use it to, say, drive some element of my task app. So what I can do is here we've got our task list. So what I'll do here is I'll create a data store. So we'll call this task. Let's call it task list identity store. And we'll create a new data store here. We'll add an identity. So we're going to choose our identity provider, and then we'll add the scopes that we need. Now, we don't need OpenID profile or email here. We just need our Gmail full access scope because we're not getting information about this user. We just want to access Gmail on their behalf in this case. So this is the scope that we added earlier, mail.google.com. If we connect the account, you won't see this, but it's spawned a little pop-up on my screen. So actually, let's make sure you can see this. So here we go. So yeah, there we are. So you can see it spawned a little pop-up on my screen, benroberts@toca.io. I can sign in here. it's telling me, yeah, it's gonna, you're giving Toca permission, this app permission to do this stuff. I can allow it. See, it's connected. I can add it. And now I've got an identity in my data store, which I can now use to make calls out to Google's API with this set of permissions. In this case, just the mail scope. So just to illustrate how this can be used as an example, as an activity here to get list of emails. We'll do it stateless. We don't need a GUI screen to interact with. And then we'll find our Google Actions in this case, but let's pull them all through. And then we can find our Google Actions specifically. So Google, Gmail, and you can see there's a couple of functions here, but for example, list Gmail emails, it's asking explicitly for an identity. So I can pick that identity we just created in our data store. Query is the one that I grabbed earlier, but this is essentially whatever query I'd put on my mailbox. So if, for example, you were looking for emails with an attachment, in Google you do has attachments, for example, or if you're looking to a specific address, I could say to Keith Sutton, Toca.io from me. So I could look for all emails that I've sent Keith, for example. So all of these things will query. And again, it's very similar if you're using, say, the list Outlook emails action with a Microsoft account instead of a Google account. But here we go. Here's the query here. And I can save this and I can run it through. And hopefully what we'll get is a success, which we do. And you can see I've got a bunch of emails here with some IDs that are all addressed to me. In this case, looking at this, it's emails that have been generated when I spawn, when Google sort of informs it someone's uploaded something to Drive. And you can see I've got the subject, the body type, and the body. If I want to grab, I can grab through another API call to this specific ID. But you can see there are a bunch of, I could have done exactly the same thing if I wanted to, say, interact with Drive to create folders and manipulate files. If I'd set up my application for sort of Drive interaction, you can see I can do contacts here. I can create calendar events and delete calendar events. In fact, this would be a cool one to explore for a task list app as an example. But you can see as well, there's some similar stuff from Microsoft. So Outlook, I can send emails on behalf of my user and use Outlook Inbox to do a query on my mailbox. So all very similar here, really. Other thing to note, and we looked at the API caller in our last session, is that this identity can actually be used in combination with the API caller. And what it basically does is it replaces, for most APIs, when you authenticate, you send an authorization token in the header, like a bearer token. And of course, when we went through this whole OAuth flow, the exact thing that the identity provider did was to provide us with an access token that we could use to integrate with sort of the APIs that they had. So if you want to as well, you can use the API caller in combination with an identity. So I could set my URL and my method, whatever it might be. And if I use authentication, I've also got the option of using an identity here, if indeed the identity relates to the identity provider, which relates to the API that I'm trying to interact with. So as an example, if I'd configured this for a Microsoft, for Microsoft, I could hit the Microsoft Graph API here to say, I don't know, create a Teams message. This might be https graph.microsoft.com/team/channel/channel ID. I don't know the exact format of this API. And then I could use my identity. If this was a Microsoft identity, I could use it in here. and this would automatically authenticate against that API for me. So very useful, the identities sort of in the back end. Okay, so we've got this listing out the Gmail emails. We'll leave that alone. We'll come back to it in a little bit. What we'll look at now is actually building out our task list application. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up the data sort of schema that I want to store my task lists in. So we'll create the back end first, and then we'll create the front end on top. So this data store, I'm going to call this my task data store. And then to this data store, I'm going to add two tables. So the first table I'm going to add is a task list. So this will be my parent table. So I want users inside of my application to create task lists and then add tasks to them. Each task list is going to have simply a name, and then we'll use the relations later to I get a bit of feedback, so that might just be my mic. And then each task list is going to have a relation to a set of tasks, which these can then add. And in doing this, we'll hopefully demonstrate the how to use the relational table structure. So each task here is going to have probably just a name, and then it will also have, let's give it a status as well, which we can use to say whether that task has been completed or whether it's still open. So we'll add this. Now, there are two ways to add a relationship between these two tables. I can either do it from my entity view up here, and I can drag an arrow from my task list to my task, and you'll see it asks me what sort of relation this might be. So I can do it this way. I can also do it via the table columns itself. So I can add a column to my parent table, the task list, set the type to table relation with the task table in a one-to-many, and then create like this. And what we'll see now is that my task table has the standard ID created updated columns, the name field that I added before, which is just a string, and also this task sort of relation, which is illustrated here as a sort of a one-to-many via the brackets. So this table is now set up so that we can add task lists here and correspondingly have tasks here. So to demonstrate exactly what that looks like, just to hard code the data, we can add a task list here. So we can call this list number 1. And we could add a couple of tasks here. So we could do task A, status incomplete, and task B, status complete. And if we wanted to, we could also hard code the relationships between the specific rows in this table. So I could, for example, my list 1 task list here, choose a couple of tasks and select, say, task A. And I could submit that. And you can see it's now populated this task field with that table relation. And indeed, I can step in and actually view exactly which rows that is relating to. Now, something to note here is that what this has done in the back end of Toca is it's created a foreign key constraint. And what that means is there is now a reference here, essentially a foreign key, from here to whatever, or the foreign key in the other table, but a reference from this table to the other. And that imposes a foreign key constraint. The important thing that sort of means is that if I now come in here and I try to delete task A, it will error deleting the record, and that's because there is a relationship between my task list up here, this specific line, and task A. So if I wanted to delete task A, I'd first have to delete the parent and then delete the child. And indeed, now you see that this works without issue. So that's something to note, because it's an easy place to sort of come unstuck. So I'll add a new task A back in, just for the purposes of demonstration. And we'll add a task list back as well. And what we'll do now is we'll work to we'll build some automation to add task lists and then add tasks to those task lists. And then we'll correspondingly sort of build something up in the application that uses that. So we've got our OAuth set up and our single sign-on on the application. We've configured the identity in the backend so that we can read those emails, and perhaps we could generate some tasks off the back of those. We've set up our data schema. So we've got a very simple relational structure here from, you can see here from the task list table in a one-to-many relationship with the tasks table. What we'll do now is create the automation, the sort of the CRUD automation to interact with this data schema, which we'll ultimately then use from the application. So we'll add an activity here. So we'll call this create task list. Just give it a description. And this will be pretty simple. So to create a task list, we'll find our add row to table action. I can double hit shift to search or search up here. So I'll find add row to table. The table will be the task list data store and the task list. And then the name will be whatever the user in the front end provides. So we will save this, go to our inputs tab. We'll expect an input to come from the front end called task list name, as an example here. And we'll inject that into other variables and inject that into the name field for the task list. Again, as you can see with the update in 7.5 of the platform, there's documentation attached to not only across the platform itself, but actually to each of the actions and app components as well. So if you need some guidance, the documentation is there to help you. So definitely make use of that. Now, one other sort of good practice to note here is anytime that you interact with tables inside of Toca using these actions, by default, and we'll demonstrate this here, this task list number 2, if I run a table action, it will report the full details of what it's done, what data it's added to the console when it's run via an activity, and to the reporting pipeline when it's run as part of a workflow. Now, that's fine for small units of data like this, where it's just adding this task list 2 name. But if you're interacting with heavier bits of data like JSON in tables, etc., actually that amount of data being explicitly passed to the front end or from sort of through the back end can cause things to slow down. So this is something you would be conscious of if you were sort of developing traditionally. And so there's an option on all of the table actions to redact data. And so what this means is, although you can see the operation which is sort of undergone, you're redacting data and preventing it from being written out to either the console or the pipeline to protect yourself against that sort of large data flowing. And in fact, you'll see it run a lot faster as a result, and you'll see that the data is redacted. So what you see now in our task data store is that there should be 3 task lists. Here you go. Here's the one I added unredacted, and here's the one I added redacted. They're both on exactly the same thing. The only difference is that the latter didn't output anything to the console. So that's something to be aware of, not only when you're doing, say, an add rows table, but also running an action like get table data, where you're pulling large amounts of data back and manipulating them. That isn't necessarily something that you need clogging up your pipeline. So something to be aware of that. So create task list, fine, this looks good. The next thing we need to do is add a function. Well, first thing we'll do is we'll add a workflow that maps to that so that we can call it from the app. So we'll call it create task list. We'll add start and end node. We'll pull in an activity here. And we'll join this all up. We'll add a listen to this. And so we'll create task list with an API key. You see it's automatically inferred that input. We'll remove the default value. Save. And then we'll publish this as well. Sort of stage our development. There we go. So we've now got an endpoint that we can hit from anywhere, but in particular from our app that we can use to create our task list. The next thing that we'll do is we'll add a function to create a new task, and in particular associate it with a given task list. So we'll call this create or add, let's call it add new task to task list. And we use stateless. Now, this is where we'll need to pay attention because we're now going to manipulate the table, the relationships that we've added. So if we imagine in the front end that a user is viewing one of these task lists, let's say they're viewing task list number 1, there's already a task associated with this. And so what I need to do in the back end when they want to add a new task is I need to take the current relationship state, the current set of tasks that this entity is related to, and add to it. So what I'm going to do just to demonstrate this is let's imagine that the user selected this task in the front end, and that's coming in here as an input. So we would call this task list to add to ID. Place that in here. So this is telling us which task list the user wants to add that task to. We'll add another input here for the new task name. And that should do us for now. So let's default that to new task. And so the first step that we'll need to perform here in order to add this new entity to this relationship is, well, first of all, we'll need to add it to the task table. So again, I could use my search, or I could go via the actual group, tables, manipulation. We'll add a row to the table. So we're going to add that task to our task table. The name will be the new task name, and by default, we'll set the status to incomplete. So we could run this through, and you see it runs like so. Now, this row ID we're going to need in order to manipulate the relation. So we need to point the task list row at this row to say that this new task we've created is a child of our existing task list. So what we'll do is we'll run a get table data, and we'll grab from the task list table, we'll use find the task list that the user wants to manipulate. So where the ID equals the task list to add to. And if we save it on that, we'll do get table data, and you'll see that it's pulled back the tasks. From here, if we actually look at this with a set variable in terms of what it's pulled back, we'll set a variable name to, let's call this current tasks. And we'll set it as a list, and the list will come from, this is the subchipping I think we looked at before. So all tasks, particularly it'll be the task, and then we want the IDs of whatever task we get back. So we'll save this and run this through. Let's just set a variable, just check what we're doing. So we'll do just see exactly what we get back in a string. Was it dot task dots? Yeah, my syntax was a little bit off. So we need, using our JSON path, what we actually need here is we need whatever task comes back, we need the task. You see it's bringing back an array of tasks. So we want all of those tasks, and we want the ID field, whatever IDs we get back here. So there we go, we're getting down to all the IDs that are currently in that task table. And indeed, if we were to look at this ID, so if we were to copy this here, just to sort of verify for ourselves what we're doing and look back at the task data store, you can see that what this is doing exactly is it's looking at the task that's currently associated to that task list. So it's pulling back a full list. Indeed, if I added more tasks, so if I hard-coded, let's say we had task B here, we hard-code this. So if we do task B, there you go, there's now 2 tasks in the list. And we go back here and we run exactly the same function. You'll see now, well, hopefully. I'll do task 2. Let's just set this as a string for the moment, just so we can see exactly what it's putting back. Zero dot task all. Exactly what we want. Let's try this then. Let's pull back the current tasks and see if we can do this. Yeah, okay. Bear with me, just a fire alarm here. It's just a test. There you go, that's the test over. So here we go. We've got the current tasks here. Just have a look at the structure of this. So it's bringing back, obviously it's bringing back fields other than the IDs, which is the list that we need to manipulate. So we've got record value, ID. Let's just try this again then. So let's try this structure. Record value. Yeah. Quite right. Okay, we'll do this for our JSON manipulation action in the case. This is a task. So we'll pull that back. Okay, and then to get the IDs out of here, we'll use a JSON navigator. So JSON will just be our current tasks, which we can do by our variables tab. Select many, so the query will be $all. So all of the items in here, dot record value, dot ID. And that should return us, there we go, a nice array of our current tasks that we've got associated against that task list. So from here, we can add or remove from this array. So we can do, say, a merge JSON to take the new task that we've added and add that into our list. So let's find our JSON action. We'll do modify JSON. and we'll take the result here. This is JSON. We'll merge it with another array, another JSON array, and we'll insert the ID of the task which we just added, as will come sort of from the user in the front end. So if we now run this through, this chip does not exist in the current context. Of course, it doesn't. We need to run the entire activity. So let's run the whole thing through. And now you'll see that modified JSON has taken the original list of IDs, so the original list of relationships that existed between the task list and the task table, and it's added on our new ID. Finally, what we'll do then is we'll use this list to overwrite the task list item, which we had here with the new set of relationships. So we'll do update table rows. The table will be our task list table. We want to update where the ID of this equals whatever the task list to add to ID was. So this is the one that we're wanting to update. Name we'll leave alone, and the tasks we can now data chip hopefully directly from here. And if we save and run this through, there you go, one record's been updated. We can head back to our task data store, and we should see that we now have 3 tasks. There we go, beautiful, associated with our table, the 2 tasks we had initially and the new task that we added thereafter. So just to recap what we've done there is we've added to set this up, we've added the row to the task table. So we're adding it to our database. We're getting the current list of tasks here. So let's maybe group these into a neat package. So group and get current tasks, get current task list, and merge with new task ID. So we could nest these. Get current task list maybe for this section. There we go. Modify JSON. This is then as new task to this list. There we go. So we've got the current task list. We're then modifying our JSON to add the new task to this list, and then we're using update table rows to take that modified list and overwrite it. So in doing this, we've added the task to the database, and then we've created the relationship between the specific rows of the table, the task list and the tasks. Hopefully that's somewhat clear. So we'll publish this. And again, what we'll do is we'll create a workflow so that we can call it later. So we'll call add new task to task list with a description. And again, we'll create a very simple flow which adds the new task. As a listener, so we'll add task to task list, add a key, and then again, we'll leave these inputs here so the user in front end can create that new task. Okay. Lovely, good. I'm just checking it's working. So, just again, quick recap of where we got to. So, we've created our identity provider, added the identity in the backend so we can interact with the Gmail, added it for SSO. We've created our data schema. So we stored our identity here in one data store. We've created the data schema for adding tasks in our secondary store. We've added a series of functions for manipulating the tasks over here in activities. And we've got a corresponding set of workflows which we've added to these activities so that we can call them from the front end. So let's get to the fun bit, which is building the actual application. So if I come back to my application, here it is. We can do some very basic things. Let's just set some very basic theming. So we'll do, primary and secondary accents. Let's just go for white secondary. change the typography here to Montserrat. So this looks right. Okay. Now we can save that. Now we'll create a very basic task list application that we can use to interface with our backend. So first thing we'll do is we'll drag a nav bar in, and we'll call it task list app. We'll add a flex layout underneath this to house some content, give it some margin like so. Inside of here, I think we'll put some paper. So I'm just searching for components, but of course, these are all here within the side panel as well. So we're using a paper. We won't elevate it, but we will outline it. Pop another flex in here for margin and spacing. So 3. Set the spacing between to 4. Let's maybe do the same with margin. Like so. And we'll start to build out our application. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a repeating layout here to show the user their current set of tasks. Okay. So to do this, we'll find the repeating layout and put it in like so. Now the data source will be, we need to add the data store, of course. So if we go to our settings, app resources, we can add our task data store here. We'll set it so that authenticated users and administrators can both read from it. Getting a little bit shoopy. Could you mute your mic, please? We'll also add our listeners that we created. So if we look for task, we've got create task list. And again, we'll set it so that our authenticated users and administrators can execute that. And we've got our add new task to task list, which will add permissions to in kind. So let's apply all of this. Now, inside of our repeating layout, we insect our task data store, and we'll iterate over our task list with a limit term, let's say, and we'll present those inside of our application here. Now, one of the other changes that came with 7.5, which is quite nice, is an ability to subscribe to changes here. So tables now that are pulled through to the front end will automatically update with any changes in the database, and you've got full control of whether it happens automatically or whether it's something you refresh on a basis, which you prefer. I'm still getting a little bit of feedback from someone's microphone. Let me just see. I'm just going to mute Sheepy there. There we go. Cool. So if we update now, it's not going to show us much. So let's populate this with a task list. So we will add, let's do it as a grid of cards. Set the column width to, I don't know, half the size on desktop. And then we'll add a flex layout in here. So again, let's just give things a little bit of margin. There we go. And in fact, we don't need to do this because we can control it by the repeating layout. So we've already got item spacing here, so that works quite nicely. So at the moment, we've got our roots. We've got a container for sort of displaying our page. We've got the layout. We'll add, let's call this task list, like so. And then inside of this task list, we'll add a piece of text for the title of the task list. So task list. Weirdly, my context isn't coming through. Let's just refresh that. I'll put this inside of my layout. Yes, I have. Okay, let's try tasks instead. So task. Okay, context. So we'll grab the name of all the tasks. So task A. Example here. Yeah, so this will be the name of our task, and then we can also set the status. The status, what we'll do in our task here is we'll associate that. So I'm just going to try using that over the task listable. Let's try this again. Peculiar. Let's just do iterate over our tasks in that case. There you go, and we've got our task name. And then for the status, what we'll do, I think, is in our flex layout, we'll set this to row, set it center, add some spacing. In fact, while we're here, let's set the flow of the repeating layout back to block, so these tasks move down the page. We'll add some dividers between our tasks. So let's just see where this should sit. So we can put this inside of our repeating layout, just underneath our text. Indeed, actually under the element itself, there we go. So we've got the task. And what would be nice is to show something different, a different chip color for the status. So we'll find, it's called the info chip. See if I can find it without searching. I can't. Let's have a search. So I can use the info chip here. And the info chip, we can label, again, coming from the context of the current status that we've got. So this is saying incomplete. The colors will be dynamic. And we can either pick those colors from a color sort of label table, or we can actually add the values here. So if it's incomplete, we could color it with, I don't know, something sort of reddish, let's say. And if it's complete, then we could color it with something sort of dark greenish. We'll set the typography in this one, so it's the color to white, so it's a little bit clearer. Transform the text so it's capitalized. There you go, and that looks quite good. So now if we save and preview this, here we go, we've got a list of tasks. So task A, incomplete, my new task, incomplete. And you can see we've got our list of tasks which are outstanding here. Now, what we need to do is we'll also display an element here so the user can add tasks to the various task lists that we have in the back end. So what I'll probably do actually is duplicate this flex, but we'll remove the repeating layout. Yeah, there we go. And we'll add a form here so that the user can select an existing task list and actually then update it by providing a new task. So let's add let's jig things around a little bit. So we'll add a form layout just outside of our flex, like so. And then inside of this layout now, I can add some fields. So we'll let's add some text for a title. So we'll call this create new task, like so. And we'll set the title like that. We'll add a field for the new task name. So small, call it task name, if that required. And then we can also add a field here for the task list that we'd like to associate it with. So if we find our form, we can go to select field and drag that in as well. Label, we'll call this task required. The list will come from our task list table. And in particular, it will be the name of the task list, which we'd like to add to, which we'll provide here inside of our form. So if we save and preview this, there you go, we see we've got a set of task lists which we can add to, which have some duplication in the names as per our current sort of hard-coded values in the database. And we've got the ability to add a new task. Let's just add a submit button here so the user can submit the form. So we'll call this create new task. Again, we'll just transform this. Create new task. And associate the form with the listener as we've seen before, so that we can actually call that add new task to task list listener. So submitted message will be adding task. Bear with me. Then the completed message will be task added, and here we can do failed to add task. So if we save this now, we can map our inputs to our fields. So this will be task list to add to ID, and this will just be the new task name. Now the name, obviously, we're going to take directly from the user's input, but the ID, what we want to do is display the name. So that's the key in the select field, but actually send back the ID that we use to specify the task list that we want to add to, because as we've seen, the name isn't necessarily unique. So we'll present the name to the user, but the actual value that will go back to the form, that will be the ID. So let's just test this and see if there are any sort of incomplete parts to it. So task name, we could do, let's call it Ben's task. And task list, we could do, set it to task list 1. Create a new task, and you'll see as per the updates that we selected, this is automatically added then to, this is also obviously our global list of tasks. It's not broken down by task list at the moment, but you can see that was automatically added. And indeed, if we go back to our pipeline, we can see that add new to task list was run from the app. It took in the name, the task list to add to, and indeed inferred the app user ID, which we'll come back to in a moment. It then added the task, got the current task list, the tasks associated with that list, modified it, updated it, and if we look at our database, we should see that the tasks, where is it? In our task list here, you've now got 4 tasks associated with this one, including the new task, Ben's task, which we just added. So, we could do a couple of things here to make our app a little bit more complex. The first one, if we had more detail per task and we wanted to present it in its own sort of page, we could use what's called a dynamic page to do that. So I don't think this is something we actually covered last time. But let's imagine that there's more information than just, say, the title and the status, but there might also be an assignee or a description or an image associated with that task. And actually that information would all be too much to display up here in the global list. What we might want to do is actually break that out into a separate page. So what I'll do to achieve that here is I'll add a new page and we'll call it task details. Again, this will be a sort of trivial example, but hopefully it will sort of illustrate the point. Require authentication, and we'll set it to a dynamic page. So what we'll do with this dynamic page is we'll point it at the task table, and we'll specify the task that we want to view the details of via the ID. So if we add this, it should spawn a blank page. And we can add a flex here. And we, again, we'll just add some padding to sort of space things away from the boundaries of the page. And then in our case, we could just take essentially the components that we have here inside of this flex. So we could copy those and just pop them in here to show us the detail of this task. But you can imagine, I could sort of make this a little bit more composing and set it to column, and then maybe replace the info chip with just a bit of text that might have more fields in my table, so it might have a description, etc., but then it might have task status incomplete, for example, like so. Task A, task status incomplete. And now from my homepage, what I can do is inside of each sort of row of the table that's being presented by this repeating layout, let's just preview this, is I can add a button here to open up that dynamic page. So I can add, let's say, an icon button. And this might be, so if we've got on details or open in new, yeah, lovely, open in new. And we set the size to small, color to primary, let's say. And we can set the IPL, which we looked at before. Say when this button is clicked, redirects the user to the task details page. The dynamic ID is will provide the ID of the specific task which we want those details to populate with on the sort of child page. So we'll go context ID, and we'll insert. And then we'll set this so that it opens in a modal, so that it pops up as a small sort of modal on the screen, although of course you could just have it direct to that page exactly. So if we save this now, let's just go back to our task details page, make sure the authentication is set correctly, set the modal width that will spawn to small, and update. And now if I preview this application, I've got my task list, my new tasks, and I can click into any one of these and view the details for that task. And you can see it will change per this page that spawned will change per item that I selected out. So relatively uninteresting for this very simple table with only two fields that we're also showing in this table. But as I said, if this table had more fields with, say, an image and a description, etc., this is detail that you can then break out into a separate page. And of course, when you're building data-driven applications like this in Toca, being able to redirect the user to one of these dynamic pages in that way is extremely powerful because you are then mapping essentially the data structure that you got in the back end to whatever you present to the user on the front end. So if you were building, let's say, a site for taking orders, let's say a merch store, you'd have a customer. Each customer would have some orders. Each order would have order details. And so you might want to show the list of orders, let's say, via that repeating layout, but then break out the full details of the order into its own dynamic page. And subsequently, you could show the items within the order and then have dynamic pages for each of the items, for the item details, so that users can click through there. And so the app ends up mirroring whatever data structure you sort of create on the back end. Okay, so that sort of covers, I think we covered the relational tables. We've covered the dynamic pages, and we've also got this. We could also, if we wanted to, add the function here to create a new task list, but it's relatively uninteresting. I don't think we'll learn anything particularly new in doing that. The one other thing that is interesting here, which we haven't had a look at, is how to manage table row permissions. So if you imagine that this task list app isn't just being used for my own benefit, but actually maybe I'm working with other people and I want to be able to lock down or sort of take responsibility of tasks, I might actually want to lock which rows of the table a given user can see. In this case, it's because I only want my user to see the tasks that are assigned to them. But you can think of broader use cases in which actually locking down data between different users is extraordinarily important because that data is sensitive and it doesn't want to be shared between two different users, let's say. So the way that you achieve that is by managing the table row permissions in Toca. And so table row permissions allow you to lock down rows either by platform user, so you can do it at a Toca platform level or group, or by a specific application user or a specific application group. So again, if you imagine a situation in which you had different users in an application all interacting with this task list, you might have tasks that you wanted to assign to, say, your compliance team, or some tasks that you wanted to associate to your finance team. And so you can actually separate out all of these groups and the data they can see using the permissions in that way. So let's deploy the application. We'll step back to the backend and we'll look at exactly how you can manipulate those permissions. So I'm going to add an activity here and we'll call it assign/lock task to app user. And we'll create a new action. And in particular, the two things that we need to know if we want to lock a specific task, in this case to a specific user, are the ID of the task which we want to lock and the ID of the user that we want to lock it to. So in our input output on our activity, I'm going to preempt that. So we'll add one input for app user ID. And it's important that it's keyed exactly like this for the app users, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then we'll add another one for the task to lock ID here, like so. Then inside of here, the action that we want is manage table row permissions, it's called. So here it is, manage table row permission. I can pick the table that I want to manage permissions on. So in this case, it would be my task table. Here we go. It gives me a little warning that it can only work on data store tables for permissions. We can add a permission to a single row, but you could do this to multiple rows at once if you wanted to. The row ID will be whatever task the user selects in the front end. And you see here it's asking for a user or role ID. So as I said, you can lock down these items either by, the app user ID or by the app role ID. So in our case, I could lock this down to, say, the authenticated user group inside of my apps. So again, the role ID will just take from our app user ID input. Permission will be to read, so whether they can read the row. And again, if we were being really strict, we would backdate it here as well. And so you see, we get a description now for table task, add permission, read for user, app user ID. Again, we'll wrap this now inside of a workflow. So we'll call this lock task to app user. Add a start and end node. Drag our activity in. And you can see for a CRUD application like this, the structure or the relationship between the activities and the workflows is pretty much one-to-one. It's create an activity that does a thing, so creates something or reads from it or updates it or deletes it, and then finish. So this is a very common pattern. Whereas if you were building, say, more complex backend automation, you might have a flow that comprised of several activities with sort of error handling in between for something a little bit sort of lengthier. But this ends up being the case if you're building sort of things to service an app like I am here. So the name of our listener, we'll call this lock task to app user. Add a private API key. In particular, in the inputs here, we do need on our listener, we need tasks to lock ID, but we actually don't need to explicitly ask for app user ID. So Toca will implicitly provide this. And we know this is the case because when we ran our other job, add new task to task list earlier from our application, and we looked at the job arguments, you'll recall that the app user ID was being passed through already without us even asking to. So this is useful not only for what we're doing here as an example, But if you were to say audit logging, you wanted to take an audit log of what users in your application were doing, you can actually use this app user ID, which you can see if we look at our app users, will relate directly back to a specific app user. In fact, the reason it doesn't here, and it relates to this sort of E1, CC23, etc. User, is because this is what it spawns when we're working from preview. So if we were to actually run our task list from the published application, let's have a look at that. Here's our published app. There you go. It's going to take me through Google sign in and then back towards my application. Lovely. You'll see if I run create a new task from here. So let's call it James's task. And so associate it with task list 2. When we create that new task, there you go. It's added to our, well, something's gone a little bit wrong. Perhaps it added it to our task table, but couldn't relate it to our task list. Who knows? But if we have a look at the reports, you'll see that it's actually grabbed the app user ID 3E29BBB, and you can see that that's directly related to this user ID here, 3E29BBB. And if I want to get more information about that specific app user, what I can actually do is run an action like get app user, where I can provide the app that I'm interested in, the user ID of the app, and it will tell me more information about that app user, including details like, for example, the email, if my app is authenticated using SSA. So we'll have a look at what exactly that spits out in a moment. So to return to this then, so we've set up the manage table row permissions. It's going to provide some information just for our benefit edification in the console here about the app user, and then we'll basically lock down that task to that specific user. So all we need to do now is join this up in the front end. So if we go back to our training test application and go to components, we can add a button here. So let's add, let's use another icon button. So another icon button, we'll place a tooltip around this one so that we can, the user, it's very clear to the user what it is that they're doing. And we'll move this icon button inside. So inside this tooltip, we'll say, we'll call this lock task to me. And then the button will find, see if we can find like a locking icon, lock. Lovely. There's a lock, color to, set color to primary as well, size to medium. And now if we preview this, you'll see we've now, in addition to being able to open up a detailed modal for each of our tasks, we've actually got the ability to lock the task down as well, which at the moment isn't doing much. So let's change that. We'll open up the IPL for our icon button. And actually what would be nice to include here is a little confirmation to the user to say, you know, are you sure that you want to lock down this record? So what we'll do is we'll put a click in here. You can explore through all of these component groups, but the one in particular that we're interested in is this confirmation dialog in web down here. And what this allows us to do is spawn a little dialog that confirms, surprisingly, whether we'd like to take some subsequent action. So we can say lock record to user, are you sure? Confirm action. So this will be what the button reads. So we'll say lock it down, and cancel action, never mind. And so if we save and preview this to show what this is doing, we lock task to me, it now spawns a little confirmation modal, say, are you sure? Lock it down, never mind. And we're not really doing anything with this at the moment, but this is the basic principle. So let's take that confirmation and conditionally lock down the task. Again, if we open up through our nodes, the one that we're interested in now is an exclusive. So what we want to do here is say if the user selects yes, so if they confirm the action, then do lock something, and if they don't, maybe let's send an error message to say no worries. So exclusive here, and let's connect first up to our. We'll do an execute listener, but we'll just need to add that listener in our app resources that we need. So this will be lock task to app user. There we go. And we want to set that so that authenticated users and administrators can lock it down. And now, if we join this up, lock task to app user, task to lock ID will be from context, it will be the ID of the task that we're currently on. Again, if you remember from before, that context is being generated per row. So obviously depending on which instance of the icon button they click, it will point to a different task. And then in our exclusive here, we'll just set this so that it only goes that way if the value that came out of our confirmation dialog, you can see this is a Boolean. If that value is true, then we will go down to our execute listener like so. Otherwise, if it's not true, maybe we could spawn a little snack bar notification. So let's do that on here. No worries, not locking, duration. Let's say that's pops up for 2000 seconds, and the variant is info. And again, we'll just set our exclusive so that this only takes effect if the condition is not met. So if it's not true, so it's false, then flow down this branch. If the user confirms, then flow down this branch. So now if we save and preview this, what we should see is we click on a task to lock it down. If I click never mind, it doesn't really do much. If I do lock it down, hopefully what it's done, if I've configured this correctly, maybe I haven't, is to subsequently execute our listener. So let's just check what we're getting here, just to make sure that we configure this correctly. So let's do a log, just log out whatever this confirmation dialog pops out here. Let's preview this. Now we'll have a look in our browser console. And if we lock task and I hit lock it down, it doesn't actually appear to be triggering anything off the back. So in that case, what we'll do is we'll bypass this confirmation dialog for the time being. And some of this logic. We will create a snack bar notification in that case to say locking it down. And so for 1 second, we'll execute that listener. And then on the presumption, hopefully that it succeeds, we'll say success. And we'll trigger the success message. So if we save and preview this, lock task to me, locking it down, it will run the execute the listener. And if we have a look, here we go, it failed. Let's see why. Get app user failed. It was unable to find this user against a specific app. Okay, let's remove that. We don't need it. We just need that app ID. So if we run that again, lock task to me, locking it down, success, there we go. And now if we head back to look, you'll see it succeeded. It's taken in the task to lock, which we provided explicitly. It's implicitly ascertained the app user ID. and it's now locked this record down. You can see it succeeded. If we go to the database and we actually look at the row that's been locked, hopefully what we should see, and let's just have a look at our task data store. So if I search ID equals this value, here it is, James's task. If we look at the permissions on it here, you can see the training user can see it here, and it should have been locked down. So I suppose really it's difficult to demonstrate the fact that it's been locked because I've only got this this Google user that I can sign in with. But my point here is that if you had multiple users using this application now, and you'd locked this record or this row down to this specific user, actually, even without changing any properties of the repeating layout, etc., no other users would be able to see this specific record now, because as soon as you add sort of add permissions to it, the permissions are additive. So by default, everyone that's got default permissions to see it, like the authenticator group, will be able to see it. But as soon as you specify specific users, it will actually lock that row away behind those permissions. Indeed, I could remove explicitly access from my user to view this specific row, and it would simply drop out of their application. So this is one way of ensuring when you're, as I said, if you've got an application where you're displaying different sort of details to different users, you want to lock records per client or per company, whatever it is you're building. That managed table row permissions is incredibly powerful for doing that. So with groups, it would be a case of, well, I'll show you. So we could add an input here rather than our app user ID, let's say. We would have to explicitly add an input, but we could call this group ID, or in particular here, what we're actually doing is the role ID, for example. And all you would do here is, instead of passing so let's see if we can get that. If we find that best way to illustrate this, we can get specific app user. Okay, so here we go. Here's my user, right? So what you could do, if you wanted to lock it to that user's group, there you go, lovely. So let's delete this. So instead of locking it to the user directly via their app user ID, what you could do is you could take in their app user ID implicitly, get their app user. This returns you a list of the groups and indeed the roles that they're associated with. And then if they're a member of, say, the authenticated user group, but you can have whatever groups you wanted, you then use this role ID instead of the app user ID inside of your managed table row permissions. So I could, for example, here in my user/role ID, I would simply grab let's find it, the roles, and it'd be the ID for, in this case, the authenticated users group. So I could pull that through here, and I could do exactly the same thing and lock it down to the entire group that way. But of course, you can also explicitly pass a specific role rather than sort of varying it by the user. So if you want to do that, you've got an action called get app groups, which you can run anytime you want. That will get all groups of an app. And it will return a list of all the groups in your app and all the roles in your app. And then you could just say hard code this for a specific role. So rather than get it per user, you could say, if the user, that's just an admin using the front end, and they could say lock record to X group. You take the group that they select, grab the corresponding ID, and then again, exactly the same, you would just hard code it there, let's say, as an example. So the action is sort of agnostic to whether it's a group or a user ID, a role, sorry, I should say. Okay, well, I think this is probably a good place to end things in that case.